She only came to buy milk and bread, but within minutes 2 cops had poured water over her head, laughing as she cried for help. They thought she was helpless. They thought she was alone. This is the story of Naomi Blake, the woman who turned humiliation into history, and the sheriff who made the system bow to justice. Naomi Blake, a heavily pregnant black woman in a sky blue dress, clutching her belly with one trembling hand and her grocery receipt with the other. Her eyes darted between the 2 officers closing in on her. "I told you, I paid for it," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "You can check the cameras." But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. He sneered, circling her like a predator that smelled weakness. "Oh, sure. You people always have an excuse, don't you?" Naomi's stomach turned. People around her whispered, recording, but none stepped forward. Then, from behind her, Officer Mitchell twisted the cap off a bottle of water. A cruel grin spread across his face. "Maybe she just needs to cool down," he said. And before Naomi could move, icy water splashed down her head, soaking her dress, dripping down her arms. She gasped, instinctively wrapping both hands around her stomach to shield her unborn child. Laughter broke out from someone in the crowd. Another voice whispered, "Is she okay?" Naomi blinked through tears. Her heart pounded, a mixture of fear and rage bubbling inside her. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but steadying with each word. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The automatic doors of Henderson's Market slid open behind them, and the noise died instantly. Heavy boots stepped out from the shadowed entryway. A tall man in a tan sheriff's uniform approached, his face carved from stone. His voice rumbled low and cold. "Put that bottle down." The officers froze, the crowd went silent, and Naomi finally lifted her head, tears, strength, and fire gleaming in her eyes. The officer's smirk vanished the moment he heard that voice. The water bottle slipped from Mitchell's hand, rolling across the hot pavement, glugging the last drops of its cruelty. Daniels straightened his posture, scanning the newcomer with sudden unease. The man stepping forward wore authority like armor. His badge read, "Sheriff James Blake, Naomi's husband." His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with a fury that could silence a riot. Every step he took seemed to echo across the stunned crowd. "Sir, this woman was causing a disturbance," Daniels began, his tone stuttering. James cut him off with a voice that rumbled like thunder. "This woman," he said, pointing a steady finger at Naomi, "is my wife, and you just assaulted a pregnant woman under my jurisdiction." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "He's the sheriff?" While another lowered their phone, suddenly ashamed. Mitchell's mouth opened, but no words came out. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the weight of guilt. Daniels took a cautious step back, his face pale as the realization hit him. They hadn't humiliated a random woman. They had just humiliated the sheriff's family. Naomi stood there, water dripping from her hair, her hand still over her belly. For the first time since the incident began, she didn't feel small. James moved to her side, removing his jacket and placing it gently over her shoulders. His voice softened. "Are you okay, baby?" She nodded weakly. "I told them I paid for everything. They just wouldn't listen." James turned to the crowd. "Everyone who recorded this, don't delete it. Justice is about to be served." He looked back at the officers, who now stood frozen, sweat beading under their collars. Badge and gun. Now, neither man moved. The silence thickened. Then James took one step closer, and his next words made both officers' knees buckle. "Because when the sheriff's wife bleeds, the whole department answers for it." The crowd gasped again. Phones went back up, capturing every second. And for the first time, the 2 cops who thought they held the power realized they were standing in the shadow of a man who truly did. The air outside Henderson's Market had gone still, so quiet that even the faint hum of traffic down the street felt distant. The 2 officers who had laughed moments earlier now stood trembling, their arrogance melting into fear under Sheriff Blake's glare. "Sheriff, it was just a misunderstanding," Daniels stammered. "We thought she was—" James cut him off sharply. "You thought she was what? A thief? Because she's black? Because she's pregnant and tired?" Daniels opened his mouth, but no sound came. Mitchell shifted uneasily, his lips twitching as he tried to find an excuse. But there was none. The video clips already circling the crowd would tell the truth before they ever could. James looked at Naomi, his eyes softening for just a moment. She stood tall now, the humiliation replaced by quiet strength. The water had dried into dark streaks across her dress, but her pride stood untouched. "I told them, James," she said softly. "They didn't care. They called me loud, said I was resisting. I was just trying to explain." James nodded slowly, then turned back to the men. His hand moved toward his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Blake. I've got 2 officers, Daniels and Mitchell, detained for assaulting a civilian. Send Internal Affairs and backup immediately." The officers' faces went white. "Sheriff, please, this will ruin our careers," Mitchell begged. "You should have thought about that before you poured water on a pregnant woman," James replied coldly. "Before you disrespected someone's mother, before you forgot what that badge means." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone clapped quietly. Then another. Within seconds, applause filled the parking lot. People shouted, "Justice, and hold them accountable," as the 2 officers were ordered to stand aside. Naomi took her husband's hand, her eyes glassy but defiant. "You didn't have to come so fast," she whispered. James gave a faint smile. "I didn't. Someone sent me the video before you even finished crying." Naomi's eyes widened. "Already?" James nodded, his gaze scanning the phone still recording. "By morning, the whole state will know what they did." Behind them, the red letters of Henderson's Market gleamed under the fading sun, the place where humiliation was turned into reckoning. And as the officers stood in disgrace, surrounded by the crowd they once controlled, Naomi felt her child kick softly, as if even the unborn knew that justice had finally spoken. Blue and red lights began to flash in the distance, bouncing off the glass doors of Henderson's Market like restless flames. The once chaotic parking lot now stood transformed, not into a crime scene but a courtroom under the open sky. The crowd that had gathered earlier, silent and hesitant, now leaned forward, ready to testify with their phones, their voices, their truth. Sheriff James Blake stood tall, one arm protectively wrapped around Naomi's shoulders. The look on his face was steel carved by justice, yet beneath it flickered something deeper, pain. Pain that his wife had been treated as less than human by men who wore the same uniform he'd dedicated his life to defending. "You think this badge makes you untouchable?" James asked quietly, his eyes fixed on Daniels. "It doesn't. It makes you accountable." Daniels swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Sheriff, we didn't know she was your wife." James stepped closer. "That's the problem. You should have respected her before you knew who she was." A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. People nodded, some with tears in their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had witnessed. From the corner, an elderly woman raised her voice. "Sheriff, we saw it all. We got it on video." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "Keep it safe, ma'am. That video isn't just about my wife. It's about every woman you've disrespected before her." Naomi looked up at him, her hand resting over her stomach. "James, don't let anger destroy you," she whispered. He exhaled slowly. "Anger didn't bring me here," he said softly. "Love did." Then, flashing lights painted the asphalt as Internal Affairs units pulled up. 2 plainclothes investigators stepped out, their expressions grim. "Sheriff Blake," one said formally, "we'll take it from here." James nodded, but didn't step aside. "You'll take them," he said, pointing at Daniels and Mitchell. "But you won't take my voice. I want this department to look itself in the mirror tomorrow morning." The investigators nodded. The officers were read their rights in front of everyone, the same crowd they had mocked moments ago. Phones caught every second. Naomi stood tall beside her husband, the sunset glinting off the wet streaks still drying on her blue dress. The crowd began to cheer, not just for her, but for every person who had been told to stay quiet. And as the officers were led away, cuffed and silent, Naomi whispered to her unborn child, "You'll grow up in a world that fights back." The crowd erupted once more. Justice had found its voice, and it spoke through a woman who refused to bow, and a sheriff who refused to let her stand alone. By sunrise the next morning, Henderson's Market was unrecognizable. The parking lot that had echoed with injustice only hours before was now swarming with cameras, reporters, and flashing microphones. Satellite vans lined the street. Words like racial profiling, abuse of power, and sheriff's wife assaulted screamed across every news headline. Inside their modest home on the edge of town, Naomi Blake sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a robe, her damp hair tied back. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. Her eyes were fixed on the television screen, replaying the same footage, over and over again, of the officers pouring water over her head. She winced every time the clip looped. "They made me a headline, James," she murmured, "but not for the reasons I wanted." Across the room, Sheriff James Blake stood by the window, his uniform half-buttoned, phone buzzing every few seconds with calls from the county office, state investigators, and even the mayor. His voice stayed low, steady, controlled, but his eyes carried a storm. "They needed to see it, Naomi," he said finally. "People forget until it happens to someone close to power." Naomi turned toward him, her expression soft but resolute. "Then use that power right. Don't just protect me, fix the system that made them think they could do that." James met her gaze. There was no fear in her eyes now, only strength, the same strength that had made him fall in love with her years ago. A knock came at the door. James opened it to find reporter Maya Green, mic in hand, cameraman waiting behind her van. "Sheriff Blake," she said quickly, "America wants to hear your statement. Are the officers still in custody? What charges will they face?" James hesitated, glancing back at Naomi. She gave a small nod. He stepped onto the porch, cameras rolling. "This isn't about who my wife is," he began. "It's about what she represents. Every person who's been disrespected, ignored, or abused, because someone thought a uniform made them better. Not in my town. Not anymore." Maya lowered her mic slowly, realizing she had just captured more than a soundbite. She had captured a reckoning. Naomi watched from the doorway, one hand resting on her belly. The child kicked gently, as if sensing the change in the air. For the first time since that day, Naomi smiled. Not because justice had come, but because truth had begun to rise. The next few days tore through the small town like a wildfire. What started as a single act of cruelty in a grocery store parking lot had become a national storm. Headlines screamed, "Pregnant black woman humiliated by officers. Her husband eyes the sheriff." Inside the sheriff's office, the mood was heavy. Deputies avoided eye contact, their badges suddenly feeling heavier on their chests. Sheriff James Blake stood before his team, not as their boss, but as a man demanding reflection. "We swore an oath," he said firmly, voice echoing off the old wooden walls. "Not to protect a color or a class, but people. All people." Silence filled the room. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to stop. "Two of our own crossed a line," he continued. "And the question now is, how many others looked away when they shouldn't have?" A few deputies shifted uncomfortably. One, a young rookie named Reed, spoke up quietly. "Sir, I've seen things, small stuff, comments, profiling, jokes. I didn't think it mattered." James fixed his gaze on him. "It matters now. It always did." Meanwhile, across town, Naomi sat in their living room, scrolling through messages of support from strangers across the country. "You are the face of courage," one message read. Another said, "Your baby will be born into a world you changed." Tears welled in her eyes. She had never wanted fame. But now, her pain had become a mirror for thousands. A knock sounded again. This time it was the police commissioner, an older man with silver hair and a stiff jawline. He removed his hat as James greeted him. "Sheriff Blake," he said solemnly, "the governor saw the footage. He's ordering a full review of every officer under your department. This won't be easy." James nodded, unflinching. "Good. Maybe it's time the hard part finally started." Later that night, James returned home to Naomi, exhaustion etched into his face. She stood from the couch, walking to him slowly, her hand resting on her belly. "You did what's right," she whispered, "even if it costs you everything." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "If truth costs me everything," he said softly, "then it's a price worth paying." The room was quiet, but beyond their walls the world was listening, waiting to see if this small town's sheriff would truly change the system that had nearly destroyed his family. A week later, the town square was filled like never before. Reporters, townsfolk, students, church leaders, all gathered beneath the fluttering flag outside the county courthouse. A makeshift podium stood at the front, surrounded by cameras and microphones. The sign behind it read, "Community Forum, Justice and Reform in Law Enforcement." But this wasn't just another meeting. It was history in motion. Sheriff James Blake walked onto the stage, dressed not in his uniform, but in a simple white shirt and black jacket. It was his way of saying, "Today, I speak as a man, not a badge." The applause started small, then grew louder, echoing off the courthouse walls. At the front row, Naomi Blake sat with her hands over her belly, the faint glow of pride in her eyes. She had faced humiliation, but today she wore strength like a crown. James gripped the microphone. His voice was calm, deep, resolute. "A week ago, my wife was assaulted by 2 officers wearing the same badge I wear. Many of you saw it. Some of you shared it. But this isn't about 2 bad men. It's about a culture that allowed it." The crowd grew silent, hanging on every word. "We're changing that. Starting today, my department is implementing zero tolerance for racial profiling, mandatory body cams on all officers, and a community review board led by the people, not just the police." Gasps and applause erupted. For the first time, hope felt real. Naomi's eyes shimmered with tears. This wasn't revenge. It was rebirth. Then James looked directly into the cameras. "To every person who's ever been silenced, ignored, or mistreated, know this. Your pain matters, your story matters, and as long as I wear this badge, your voice will not be buried." The crowd stood, cheering. Reporters lowered their cameras, realizing they weren't just filming a statement, they were witnessing a movement. James stepped down from the podium, walked to Naomi, and kissed her forehead gently. The crowd's applause swelled as he whispered, "This is for you, and for the world our child will inherit." Naomi smiled, resting her hand over his. "Then let's make sure that world never forgets what happened here." As the sun dipped behind the courthouse, the town that once turned its head in silence stood united, proof that even in the darkest moments, justice can rise from the tears of the innocent. And in that moment, the story of Naomi and Sheriff Blake became more than a headline. It became a legacy.